The helicopter's rotors cut through the thick Afghan night as Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison adjusted his night vision goggles. Beside him, his team of 8 Navy SEALs sat in focused silence, each man lost in his own pre-mission ritual. The intelligence briefing had been unusually vague, which always made Morrison uneasy. All they knew was that a high-value target had been identified in a remote compound near the Pakistani border, and time was running out. 2 minutes out, the pilot's voice crackled through their headsets. Petty Officer First Class Danny Rodriguez, the team's communications specialist, looked up from his equipment. "Sir, we're still not getting clear intel on what we're walking into. Command just keeps saying critical extraction, time-sensitive." Morrison nodded grimly. In his 12 years with the SEALs, he'd learned to trust his instincts, and something about this mission felt different. The urgency in the briefing officer's voice, the way certain questions had been deflected, the fact that they were going in with minimal backup, it all pointed to something bigger than a standard HVT operation. The compound came into view as they approached the landing zone. Through his night vision, Morrison could see the typical layout: a main building surrounded by smaller structures, high walls, and what appeared to be minimal security. Too minimal, perhaps. The intel suggested they were after a mid-level Taliban commander, but the lack of visible guards struck Morrison as odd. "Remember, we go in quiet, locate the target, and extract." Morrison spoke into his mic. "Intel says he's in the main building, 2nd floor, eastern room. We get him, and we're out in 15 minutes max." The team fast-roped down into the compound with practiced precision. As Morrison's boots hit the ground, he immediately noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt, multiple vehicles, and they were recent. This wasn't the hideout of a single commander. This was an active operations center. They moved toward the main building in formation, each man covering his sector. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of their extraction helicopter moving to its waiting position. As they reached the building's entrance, Petty Officer 2nd Class Marcus Chun, their demolitions expert, held up his hand and pointed to a wire barely visible in the doorframe. "Booby trap," he whispered into his mic. Morrison's mind raced. Mid-level Taliban commanders didn't usually have access to sophisticated explosive devices. This was military-grade work. He made a quick hand signal, and Chin carefully disabled the device while the rest of the team provided security. Inside the building, the team split into 2 groups. Morrison led 4 men up the main staircase, while Sergeant First Class Tony Williams took the others to clear the ground floor. The wooden steps creaked softly under their weight despite their careful movement. The 2nd-floor hallway stretched before them, lined with several doors. According to their intel, the target should be in the room at the far end. As they approached, Morrison noticed light seeping from under the door, not the faint glow of a sleeping area, but the bright illumination of someone who was very much awake and active. Rodriguez set up their portable communication relay while the others took positions around the door. Morrison checked his watch, 8 minutes since insertion. They were ahead of schedule, which should have been reassuring, but instead it added to his growing unease. Through his earpiece, Williams' voice came through clearly. "Ground floor clear, but, boss, you need to see this. We've got maps, communication equipment, and what looks like operational planning materials down here. This isn't just a hideout." Morrison acknowledged the report and turned his attention back to the door. Using hand signals, he indicated to his team that they would breach on his mark. Chun positioned a small charge on the door hinges while 2 other team members prepared for immediate entry. The explosion was brief and controlled, barely audible beyond the immediate area. The door fell inward, and Morrison's team flowed into the room with fluid precision. What they found was not what they had expected. The room was set up as a command center, with multiple communication devices, detailed maps of the region, and, most surprisingly, a man who was clearly not Taliban. He was Caucasian, well-dressed in civilian clothes, and appeared to be in his 50s. More shocking still, he didn't seem surprised to see them. "Gentlemen," the man said in accented English, "you're right on time." Morrison kept his weapon trained on the stranger while his mind processed what he was seeing. The maps on the wall showed not just local terrain, but detailed intelligence about American and coalition bases throughout the region. Communication equipment that was far too sophisticated for typical insurgent operations hummed quietly in the background. "Who are you?" Morrison demanded, his voice steady despite the confusion racing through his mind. The man smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "I think the better question, Commander, is who sent you here
This
tonight,
is our
and
moment.
what they really
Stay
told
sharp
you
and
about
follow
your
the plan.
mission." Before Morrison could respond, Rodriguez's voice came through the comm system with barely controlled alarm. "Commander, I'm picking up multiple vehicle approaches, heavy engines, at least 4 separate contacts converging on our position." Morrison's training kicked in immediately. "Williams, get your team up here now. We're compromised." As his ground floor team thundered up the stairs, Morrison turned back to the stranger, who was now reaching slowly for something on the desk. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Morrison ordered. The man paused and looked directly at Morrison. "Commander, before your evening gets much more complicated, I suggest you ask your handlers about Operation Falcon." The name hit Morrison like a physical blow. He had heard whispers of Falcon in certain circles, rumors of a deep-cover operation that went far beyond normal military intelligence. But those were just stories, weren't they? "I don't know what you're talking about," Morrison said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. "Of course you don't," the man replied. "But they do. And the fact that you're here tonight means that Operation Falcon has just become very real and very dangerous for all of us." Williams burst into the room with his team, immediately taking positions around the stranger. "Sir, we've got incoming vehicles, ETA 3 minutes. Whatever we're doing here, we need to move now." Morrison stared at the maps on the wall, his mind working furiously. The level of detail, the intelligence about American positions, the sophisticated equipment. This wasn't a Taliban operation. This was something else entirely, something that required resources and access that insurgents simply didn't have. The stranger seemed to read his thoughts. "You're beginning to understand, aren't you, Commander? This compound, your mission tonight, my presence here, none of this is what it appears to be." Rodriguez's voice cut through the tension. "Commander, those vehicles are military grade. This isn't local militia. We're looking at organized, well-equipped opposition." Morrison made a decision that would change everything. Instead of immediately calling for extraction, he looked directly at the stranger and asked the question that would haunt him for months to come. "What is Operation Falcon?" The man's smile widened slightly. "Operation Falcon, Commander, is why you're about to become the most hunted SEALs in Afghanistan. Because what you've stumbled into tonight isn't a terrorist hideout. It's a carefully orchestrated trap, and you're not the hunters. You're the prey." The sound of vehicles grew closer, and Morrison realized that their 15-minute extraction window was about to become a fight for survival. But, more than that, he realized that everything he thought he knew about their mission, their intelligence, and possibly even their own command structure was about to be called into question. Outside, the first vehicle lights appeared through the compound's main gate, and Morrison knew that whatever Operation Falcon was, they were about to become deeply involved in it whether they wanted to or not. The stranger reached slowly for a radio on the desk, his movements deliberate and calm. "I can help you get out of here alive, Commander. But first you need to understand that the people who sent you here tonight may not be the people you think they are." Morrison's world was beginning to unravel, and the mission that had started as a routine HVT extraction was becoming something far more sinister and complex than anything he had ever encountered. As the first shots rang out from the compound's perimeter, Morrison realized that the real mission was just beginning. The gunfire intensified as Morrison made a split-second decision that would define the rest of the mission. Against every protocol he'd ever been taught, he grabbed the stranger by the arm and pulled him toward the window. "You want to help us get out of here? Start talking, and start now," Morrison commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos as bullets began to strike the building's exterior walls. The man, who had identified himself only as Victor, moved with surprising agility for someone his age. "There's a tunnel system beneath this compound. The maps you see here aren't Taliban intelligence. They're CIA operational plans that were supposed to be destroyed 6 months ago." Williams positioned his team at the windows, returning fire at the advancing forces below. "Commander, we count at least 30 hostiles, and they're not using standard insurgent tactics. These guys have military training. Morrison's mind raced as he processed Victor's words. CIA operational plans meant American intelligence was somehow connected to this compound, which meant their mission briefing had been deliberately incomplete or worse, entirely fabricated. Rodriguez, get command on the line. We need immediate extraction and backup, Morrison ordered, though he was beginning to suspect that command might not be as helpful as usual. Rodriguez worked frantically with his communication equipment before looking up with confusion. Sir, I'm getting strange responses from command. They're asking for verification codes I've never heard of, and they want to know our exact status on something called Package Falcon. Victor moved to a section of the floor and began pulling up what appeared to be a hidden panel. Commander, Package Falcon isn't a person or an object. It's information. And that information is why everyone in this room is now a target. The tunnel entrance Victor revealed was sophisticated, clearly constructed by professionals rather than local insurgents. As Chun covered the entrance and Williams coordinated defensive fire, Morrison found himself facing an impossible choice. Trust a complete stranger or stay, and fight against overwhelming odds with a command structure that seemed to be playing games with their lives. What kind of information? Morrison demanded as explosions began to rock the building from what sounded like rocket-propelled grenades. Victor was already moving toward the tunnel, grabbing several files from the desk. The kind that proves Operation Falcon was never about gathering intelligence on enemy forces. It was about eliminating witnesses to American involvement in activities that Congress was never supposed to know about. The implications hit Morrison like a sledgehammer. If Victor was telling the truth, then the SEALs weren't here to extract a high-value target. They were here to be eliminated along with whatever evidence existed in this compound. Williams, get everyone to the tunnel now. Morrison shouted over the increasing gunfire. As his team began moving toward the hidden entrance, Rodriguez grabbed Morrison's arm. Sir, I'm getting a message from command. They want us to hold position and wait for backup. Morrison looked at Rodriguez, then at Victor, who was already halfway into the tunnel. Every instinct told him that waiting for backup might mean waiting to die. Rodriguez, destroy the communication equipment. We're going dark. Sir. Rodriguez looked confused. That's an order. Destroy it now. Rodriguez hesitated for only a moment before pulling out a small explosive charge and attaching it to their communication relay. The team quickly moved into the tunnel as the building above them continued to take heavy fire. The tunnel was more sophisticated than Morrison had expected, with proper ventilation and electric lighting powered by what appeared to be military-grade generators. As they moved through the underground passage, Victor explained what he knew about Operation Falcon. 6 months ago, I was a contractor for the CIA, specifically working on intelligence gathering regarding Pakistani military movements along the border. What I discovered was that certain elements within American intelligence were providing information to various groups, not to fight terrorism, but to prolong conflict in the region. Chun, who was providing rear security, reported that the gunfire above them was beginning to fade, which could mean either the attackers were moving on or they were preparing to search the compound more thoroughly. Why prolong the conflict? Morrison asked as they continued through the tunnel, which seemed to stretch for several hundred meters. Victor paused at an intersection in the tunnel system. Because prolonged conflict means continued funding, continued presence, and continued opportunities for certain individuals to profit from both legitimate military contracts and less legitimate activities. Williams, ever the practical soldier, interrupted. That's great. But who were those people shooting at us? And how did they know we'd be here tonight? Victor turned to face the team in the dim tunnel lighting. Those weren't insurgents, Sergeant. Those were private military contractors, probably paid by the same people who sent you here tonight. The plan was simple. Eliminate everyone in the compound and blame it on a terrorist attack that went wrong. Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. Including us. Especially you. Dead SEALs make excellent martyrs and provide perfect justification for expanded military operations. The tunnel ended at what appeared to be a natural cave system that opened onto a hillside several kilometers from the compound. As they emerged into the cool night air, Morrison could see fires burning in the distance where the compound had been. Rodriguez immediately began trying to establish communication with their extraction helicopter, but got only static. Sir, Either our bird is down, or they're jamming all communications in this area. Victor led them to a rocky outcropping that provided both concealment and a view of the surrounding terrain. Commander, there's something else you need to know about tonight. The person you were supposed to extract, he doesn't exist. The intelligence was fabricated to get you here. Morrison stared at the burning compound in the distance, his mind working through the implications. If their mission had been fabricated, then someone with high-level access to SEAL operations had specifically targeted his team for elimination. Who has that level of access? Morrison asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to hear the answer. That's where Operation Falcon gets truly dangerous, Victor replied. The access comes from someone inside Special Operations Command, someone with the authority to create missions and the clearance to know which teams would be assigned to carry them out. Williams checked his weapon and scanned the area through his night vision scope. Sir, we've got movement about 2 clicks south. Looks like search teams spreading out from the compound. Morrison realized they were in a situation unlike anything he'd encountered in his military career. They were potentially being hunted by their own people. They had no communication with legitimate command authority, and their only source of information was a man they'd met less than an hour ago. Victor, I need proof of what you're telling me. Documents, recordings, something concrete. Victor pulled a small device from his pocket that looked like a standard military communication unit. This contains recordings of conversations between CIA handlers and their contacts, financial records showing payments to various groups in the region, and, most importantly, the original Operation Falcon planning documents. Chen reported that the search teams were moving in their direction, which meant they needed to keep moving. Victor led them along a goat path that wound through the rocky terrain, moving away from the compound and toward what he claimed was a safe house. As they moved through the darkness, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that his entire understanding of the military structure he'd served faithfully for over a decade was crumbling around him. The possibility that elements within his own command might be targeting American soldiers for elimination was almost too horrific to consider. Victor, how do I know you're not the one playing games here? How do I know this isn't all an elaborate setup? Victor stopped and turned to face Morrison directly. Commander, in about 10 minutes, you're going to receive a communication on your backup frequency. Someone will identify themselves as Colonel Andrews from Special Operations Command, and they'll order you to return to the compound for extraction. When you hear that message, you'll know I'm telling the truth. Why? Because Colonel Andrews has been dead for 3 months. His death was classified, and only someone with access to Operation Falcon files would know to use his identity. As if on cue, Rodriguez held up his hand and pointed to his backup communication equipment. Sir, I'm receiving an encrypted message on the emergency frequency. Morrison felt his stomach drop as he realized that everything was about to change, and that the name Falcon was about to take on a significance that would threaten not just their mission, but their lives and everything they thought they knew about the war they'd been fighting. Rodriguez's face went pale as he listened to the encrypted message. He looked up at Morrison with an expression that confirmed Victor's prediction. Sir, it's Colonel Andrews. He's ordering us to return to the compound for immediate extraction. Morrison felt the weight of realization settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Victor had been telling the truth, which meant that everything else he'd said was likely accurate as well. They were being hunted by their own people. What do we do now? Williams asked, his voice steady despite the gravity of their situation. Victor continued leading them along the mountain path, moving with the confidence of someone who knew the terrain well. Now we get to the safe house, and we figure out how to expose Operation Falcon without getting killed in the process. As they walked through the rugged Afghan landscape, Morrison's mind raced through everything he'd learned. A rogue element within the military command structure was prolonging conflict for profit, eliminating witnesses, and targeting American soldiers who got too close to the truth. It sounded like something from a conspiracy thriller, but the evidence was mounting that it was terrifyingly real. Chun, who had been monitoring their backtrail, reported that the search teams had apparently given up their pursuit and were returning to the compound area. Either they think we're dead, or they're planning something else. Victor paused at a rocky outcropping and pointed to a small building nestled in a valley below them. That's our destination. It's an old shepherd's hut that I've been using as a base of operations for the past few months. The safe house was more sophisticated than it appeared from the outside. Victor had installed communication equipment, computer systems, and what appeared to be a small armory of weapons from various nations. More importantly, he had detailed files and documentation spread across several tables. For the past 8 months, I've been gathering evidence about Operation Falcon, Victor explained as he powered up his communication equipment. What started as routine intelligence work revealed a conspiracy that goes far beyond anything I initially imagined. Morrison examined the documents while his team established security around the building. Financial records showed payments to various groups throughout Afghanistan and Pakistan, but not for the reasons one would expect. Instead of paying for intelligence about enemy movements, the money was being used to provide weapons and information to insurgent groups to ensure continued conflict. This is insane, Rodriguez said as he reviewed intercepts of communication between CIA handlers and their contacts. They're literally funding both sides of the war. Victor nodded grimly. Prolonged conflict means continued justification for military presence, continued defense contracts, and continued opportunities for certain individuals to profit enormously from the situation. Williams discovered something even more disturbing in the files. Sir, look at this. There's a list of military personnel who have been eliminated because they discovered information about Falcon operations. The list contained names of soldiers from various units who had supposedly been killed in action over the past 2 years. But, according to Victor's documentation, they had actually been targeted for elimination after discovering evidence of the conspiracy. Morrison felt a cold fury building in his chest. How many? At least 37 confirmed deaths, possibly more, Victor replied. Soldiers, intelligence officers, contractors, anyone who got too close to the truth about Operation Falcon. Chin interrupted from his position at the window. Movement in the valley, multiple vehicles approaching from the south. Victor quickly moved to his communication equipment and began sending encrypted messages to several different destinations. I've been expecting this. They've tracked us here, which means we need to move quickly. Morrison watched as Victor sent what appeared to be data files to various locations around the world. What are you doing? Insurance. If we don't survive the next hour, at least the evidence will reach people who can do something about it. Rodriguez was monitoring multiple communication frequencies and reported that he was picking up coordinated radio traffic from at least 6 different teams converging on their position. Sir, they're surrounding the area. Professional coordination, military-grade equipment. Morrison realized they were facing the ultimate test of his career and his principles. They could try to fight their way out and likely die in the process, or they could surrender and hope that legitimate authorities would eventually discover the truth. Neither option was particularly appealing. Victor finished his transmissions and turned to the team with a grim expression. Gentlemen, I've just sent complete files about Operation Falcon to investigative journalists in 3 different countries, as well as to several members of Congress who have been asking uncomfortable questions about defense spending. Williams kept watch through the window as the approaching vehicles got closer. How long before they reach us? Maybe 10 minutes, Chin reported from his observation position. Morrison made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Rodriguez, send a message to Admiral Patterson at JSOC. Use the emergency authentication codes and tell him we have evidence of a conspiracy within Special Operations Command targeting American personnel. Sir, what if Admiral Patterson is part of the conspiracy? Morrison looked at his team, then at Victor, who had risked everything to expose the truth. Then, we're probably going to die. But if he's not, then maybe we can stop this. Victor handed Morrison a small device that contained copies of all his evidence. Commander, regardless of what happens here tonight, this information needs to reach the right people. Operation Falcon has to be stopped. Rodriguez successfully transmitted the message to Admiral Patterson and received an immediate response that surprised everyone. Sir, Admiral Patterson is ordering all units in this area to stand down and requesting our immediate extraction by a verified JSOC team. The relief in the room was palpable, but Victor remained cautious. How do we know this isn't another trap? Morrison considered the question carefully. We don't. But we've reached the point where we have to trust someone. and Admiral Patterson has never given me reason to doubt his integrity. Chen reported that the approaching vehicles had stopped about a kilometer away and appeared to be holding position. Something's changed. They're not advancing anymore. Rodriguez monitored the communications frequencies and reported increased radio traffic between various units, much of it in authentication codes that suggested high-level command intervention. "Sir, it sounds like there's some kind of standoff happening out there." 30 minutes later, they heard the distinctive sound of helicopters approaching from the north. Rodriguez confirmed that the incoming aircraft were broadcasting proper JSOC authentication codes and were being escorted by military fighters. Victor gathered his evidence files and looked at Morrison with something that might have been respect. "Commander, you made the right choice. But understand that this is just the beginning. Operation Falcon has tentacles throughout the military and intelligence communities. The people responsible for tonight will try to cover their tracks and eliminate loose ends." The extraction team that landed near the safe house was led by someone Morrison recognized, Master Chief Petty Officer Thomas Kane, a SEAL he'd served with years earlier and trusted completely. "Jake," Kane said as he approached the building, "Admiral Patterson wants you and your team in secure debriefing immediately. We've got multiple federal agencies mobilizing based on the information you transmitted." As they prepared to leave with the extraction team, Victor handed Morrison one final piece of evidence: a photograph showing several high-ranking military officers meeting with representatives from various defense contractors. "The man in the center of that photograph," Victor said, pointing to a figure Morrison recognized, "is the one who ordered your elimination tonight. His name is Brigadier General Marcus Hayworth, and until 6 hours ago, he was Deputy Commander of Special Operations." Morrison stared at the photograph, recognizing not just General Hayworth, but several other officers he'd encountered throughout his career. The conspiracy was larger and reached higher into the military hierarchy than he'd imagined possible. Kane confirmed that General Hayworth and 17 other officers had been arrested in coordinated raids across 3 different military installations. "The evidence you provided triggered the largest investigation into military corruption in modern history." As their helicopter lifted off from the Afghan mountainside, Morrison looked down at the country where he'd spent years of his life fighting what he'd believed was a clear-cut war against terrorism. Now he understood that the reality was far more complex and far more corrupt than he'd ever imagined. Victor, who was being transported to a secure location for extensive debriefing, leaned over to Morrison and said something that would stay with him forever. "Commander, tonight you learned that the most dangerous enemies aren't always the ones shooting at you from the outside. Sometimes they're the ones giving you orders from within your own command structure." 6 months later, Morrison testified before a closed session of Congress about Operation Falcon. The investigation led to the conviction of 23 military officers and defense contractors, the restructuring of several intelligence oversight committees, and new protocols for monitoring military operations. But for Morrison and his team, the knowledge of how close they'd come to being eliminated by their own people was a burden they would carry for the rest of their lives. They had uncovered a conspiracy that threatened the very foundations of military integrity, and they had survived to tell the truth. The name Falcon had initially represented everything that was wrong with the military-industrial complex. But for Morrison's team, it ultimately came to represent their determination to preserve the honor and integrity of the armed forces they'd sworn to serve. When people asked Morrison about that night in Afghanistan, he would simply say that sometimes the most important missions are the ones that force you to choose between following orders and following your conscience. On that night, they had chosen conscience, and it had made all the difference. The whispered name, Falcon, had indeed changed everything, but not in the way the conspirators had intended. Instead of silencing witnesses to corruption, it had exposed the truth and reminded everyone that even in the darkness of conspiracy and betrayal, there were still people willing to stand up for what was right.